Another trend that I know a lot of companies and lawyers are watching is what types of benefits the government will offer for cooperation.
I think one of the biggest challenges for companies is not so much whether they cooperate, because when the government comes knocking, most companies will cooperate. It's whether or not they voluntarily disclose the conduct that the government doesn't know about. And I think that's a real challenge. What the department will say, what I think the SEC will say, is there are some specific benefits that they may qualify for, such as avoiding a guilty plea, getting a declination, getting a non-prosecution agreement or deferred prosecution agreement. So what the agreement looks like. When I was at the department, I declined more cases than we brought. Now, be that as it may, the problem is, I think, companies legitimately say, but what are the benefits for us? Like, what do I actually know going in the door? Versus a guilty plea versus a declination. That's a big delta. And how do I know what I'm going to get? In addition, the government will try to reduce the penalty, and I think they often do, including going below the guideline range. And you can avoid a monitor. So there are some benefits, but I think the challenge that companies face is, how do I know I will get those benefits, and what will they ultimately look like for my company?
What are things a company can do to avoid the possibility of being assigned a monitor?
The first thing, if I were a company and I were in trouble, the first thing I would do is start remediation now. One of the problems I think companies sometimes face, at least in the past, was they would start the investigation and they'd be sort of all the way down the investigation, maybe even years in the investigation. Then they say, okay, now we're going to remediate. Well, the problem is if you do that and you wait that long and you don't have it dual tracked, you're now implementing changes into a compliance program, you're remediating in terms of termination or discipline of employees and the like, and it's so new that the SEC and DOJ will legitimately say, well, how do we know that this is sustainable or meaningful? And so you got to start sort of day one, in addition to the investigation, thinking in terms of remediation. I think that's the most important.
And that's a common error too, right? I mean, you see that they don't want to invest in the remediation, or they don't want to believe the case is as serious as it might be, and they just get themselves into trouble. And also, it's very transparent to the regulators that you're hustling it up at the last second. I mean, that you just see that.
And sometimes it's that, and then the other aspect I would say is that because they're so busy and worked up on the investigation side, they just lose track of that this is another important component that they will ultimately want to have a great story on a year or 2 years from now, but you got to start today. And that's where you can't forget to start today about that, looking at the remediation.
Another thing that gets in the way of starting that remediation early is a fear that if you do remediate, it will actually highlight your problems, highlight the things that you haven't been doing, that will be viewed negatively by the government.
I think DOJ and SEC understand those risks. They would expect it. I mean, the truth is that if you put in a new compliance program, you've got training and additional internal controls, and it hasn't uncovered any issues at all, that would lead to suspicion, I think, by DOJ and SEC that it's not a robust enough program if you're really not getting people to come forward and say, oh, by the way, we've been doing it this way for years. Is that a problem? And so I think you do get a certain amount of credit for that from the department, even if issues are uncovered.
There's still, however, notwithstanding what Chuck said, which is very important, there's still a vast number of companies that don't disclose because of their sense of lack of predictability. And I know that this is something the department is kind of hammering on about predictability. But I think that more times than not, when you're getting into the situations, that companies will opt to remediate and not disclose, thinking that, well, if we are found out, we'll just roll the dice and take our chances. But it's a very, very difficult decision to raise your hand and say, I'm going to go in and ring that phone and walk over to Chuck's former office.